And we are at 12 o'clock. So thanks to everybody for joining us for this inaugural Lunch and Learn, sponsored by Catawba College's Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service and the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. I'm Dr. Michael Bitzer. I'm the director of the center and a professor of politics and history here at Catawba College. And I'm honored today to be joined by the author of the book. Here it is, Harbingers, What January 6th and Charlottesville Reveal About the Rising Threat to American Democracy. And the author is Tim Heaphy. Tim is currently a partner at the firm Wilkie, Farr, and Halliger, and he spoke to a group of us associated with the Democracy Resilience Network with the Carter Center. And I thought in this time period, no better person could come and speak to us and the network about some of the issues that our country is confronting than Tim. And I want to kind of acknowledge the news of the day with the government shutdown today. It might be good to start our chat with a concept that's embedded in the center's name, that of public service. Tim, you've spent a great deal of your professional career in the field of government. You've risen to the level of being a U.S. attorney for the Western District of Virginia and independently worked with the city of Charlottesville and their review of the Unite the Right rally, and also served as chief investigative counsel to the House of Representatives January 6 Select Committee. With your extensive background, could you talk a little bit to kind of get this conversation started about how you think and define the idea of public service?
So I went in, thanks, Michael, for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I really appreciate having an opportunity to talk about these issues because we need to talk about them. All of us need to be paying attention to what's going on. And you raising that question, these issues is really important. I went to law school originally because I wanted a tool to make the world more just and humane and fair. And I think lawyers have an ethical obligation to do that. I think people have an ethical, moral obligation to do that in a democracy, to be mindful of their obligation as citizens to sort of show up and participate in democracy. I've been fortunate over the course of my career to have a number of public service opportunities where I have been able to use my skills as a lawyer or an investigator to bring understanding of things, difficult things that have occurred, a sense of accountability as a prosecutor or understanding as an investigator. And that's been really satisfying. And I always tell young lawyers, young people, that they should pay attention to values when they make career choices. That too many people in this world just sort of blindly go along with, respond to opportunities instead of intentionally go toward them. And I have sort of knew early on that I wanted to be involved in endeavors that felt public service oriented. My father was involved in law enforcement. My mother was a teacher. So I kind of grew up with this ethic. So I didn't always know what form that would take over the course of my life from, time I was a kid to now. But that thread has run through it. I have wanted to do things that felt like they were moving the needle of justice or making the world a more fair, just, and humane place. That value choice has guided my career and other things beyond my career. So for particularly your students who are paying attention, whatever that value is for them, whatever that issue is that motivates them, I would encourage paying attention to that and making choices that reflect that.
That's a great start to it, and we were talking before the webinar started. It feels like nowadays this value of public service is so needed, but confronting that value over particularly the past 2 weeks, it feels like America's dealing with incident after incident of violence. Politically, the shooting of Charlie Kirk, to the four mass attacks this past weekend in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Texas, and right here in North Carolina. I've had several people come up to me and say, "How are you processing? How are you dealing with all this?" And I want to ask you the same kind of question. How are you processing all that is going on in our country when the nation feels so deeply troubled?
Yeah, it's hard. It's difficult mentally and emotionally to go toward the problem or to dive into this, to read and to think about it. I think what it reflects, Michael, is that the fundamental divide in America is no longer left versus right, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat. It is more insiders versus outsiders. It's people who believe in institutions, government, media, higher education, even science, and people that think that those traditional institutions are broken, do not work for them. People that don't think government serves the common good, people that don't trust what they read in the media, people that think higher education is one-sided and ideologically, people who think institutionalized science somehow is profit-driven more than science-based. That undercurrent in our culture, I think, is sort of the fundamental explanation for the divide that from which we suffer. So as I see these instances of political violence are sort of spasms of that, right? There are a couple different reactions you can have to cynicism about institutions. You can get mad, right? That's what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. That was a broad forum of anger at institutions that manifests in breaching the Capitol building. No more important symbol of institutions or of government than the Capitol. But it also manifests in apathy and my fear. This is a big portion, big takeaway of the book that you referenced at the beginning is that a lot of citizens, I fear, in America who understandably feel that cynicism about institutions, they don't get mad, they just withdraw. They get
Right.
apathetic. And that to me is a greater threat to democracy than anger, right? We can manage anger, we can harden events and keep people safe. We don't always do that well, which we can talk about, but apathy is harder to combat. And my fear is that things like the episodes of political violence that you referenced only exacerbate the lack of faith in institutions and that pullback, that apathy. So when these things happen, right, my instinct is what can we do about it, right? What could we as citizens do to counter that? But my fear is that a lot of people go the other way. They say, "Man, I'm just going to go to work and take care of my family," and it makes them withdraw from paying attention, trying to understand what's going on, and engaging in civic life.
One of the things that you talk about, and particularly, and I want to kind of keep that focus of the issue of anger versus the issue of apathy. What we have seen on the anger side is something that you devoted an entire chapter to, and that is about social media. You write about it being a concern of yours as a rising threat, and you talk about social media being the tendency to hook users, to warp their perceptions, and to manipulate their emotions as a feature and not necessarily a bug. I think when, the prevalence of social media first started, it was thought, hey, this is bringing the world together, but at times it feels like it's only driving us apart. Where do you see the role of social media as it continues to expand and new and different platforms come on? How much of a threat is it to our
Yeah.
American democracy?
It is a big threat, not in and of itself, not inherently, but in terms of how it is used and how it affects the information ecosystem. So one of the big lessons for me in these investigations that I led in Charlottesville and at the Capitol were how many people in this country now, Michael, get their information exclusively through these curated, algorithm-driven social media feeds, right? So I grew up at a time where there were three television networks and a daily newspaper, and they were sort of everybody paid attention to the same sources of information. And those sources were held to a legal standard of accuracy and balance. Now, more and more people, young people to people my age, are not going straight to those sources, but are rather only getting to a television network or a newspaper if a link to that shows up in their social media feed. The biggest example of this that I talk about in the book was this guy named Stephen Ayers. Stephen Ayers was a witness that we called in one of our January 6th hearings with the select committee. And he was a carpenter in Erie, Pennsylvania, was a Trump supporter. And when the president was defeated in the election in the fall of 2020, he started reading about the election on Facebook. That was his social media platform of choice. And because of the things on which he clicked and the things that he read, the algorithm sent to him more and more similar information and increasingly provocative information. There's a lot of data that the way that these are profit-driven, corporate entities, these social media, these are private companies that their whole goal is to hook and maintain your interest. And there's a lot of data that if your feed is sending you things that sort of roughly correspond to things in which you've expressed interest and are increasingly provocative, that generate emotion, particularly anger, then you're more likely to stay on the platform. So Stephen Ayers, a couple of questions about the election, he's off into the stop the steal narrative and all these bogus theories of election fraud. And then he's getting like QAnon content, right, shipped to him. And before he knows it, he's invited to join an affinity group. So Facebook also sort of monitors which users are interested in similar things and then proposes that they could join these groups. You click on a link and then you're in the Stop the Steal group. That's what happened to Stephen Ayers. Through that, he then meets some people that say, hey, we're going to Washington for this big rally on January 6th. Why don't you come with us? He says, yes. So all came together strictly from his engagement through Facebook with people that he didn't know before. And then he finds himself at the Ellipse for the speech, and he's walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, and he's inside the Capitol. That's really common. And I don't mean to suggest that Stephen Ayers is a victim. Like, he made affirmative choices to consume certain information and not challenge that. But the danger is that, again, people get into these echo chambers where they're only really getting a perspective that reinforces their original perspective, not like a newspaper or a more balanced news outlet that has some modicum of balance. And there's a lot of misinformation that proliferates. So Facebook and other social media companies really do very little to flag and ultimately take down misinformation, right? Again, they're not held to a legal standard like the New York Times or CBS News, where if you had put something out there that's clearly false, then they could be sued for defamation. Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1996 says social media platforms are bulletin boards. They are not held to the legal standard of a content provider like a newspaper, and therefore they have very little incentive to restrict anything. And Meta in particular, the company that owns Facebook, prides itself on being sort of a free speech zone and does not take down stuff. It's up to the user to sort of sift and filter that themselves. So that is the dynamic increasingly through which Americans are getting their information. And the danger of that is that a lot of false information proliferates and people are not really learning about contrasting views, but are simply in these echo chambers where their own views are reinforced and increasingly pulled to the extremes because the algorithm does that. We have to understand that dynamic. We can talk about appropriate responses to it. But that I think is really important to understand that is now the primary way in which Americans are receiving and processing information.
Yeah, I ask my students every semester, it doesn't matter what class, I ask them, where do you get news
Yeah,
about the world? And to a person nowadays, these are digital natives. They have learned nothing other than being on their phones and getting the information.
yeah,
And they all say to a person pretty much, I get my news from social media.
right.
And one of the questions I had after reading that particular chapter, you talk about I think at the end, you say content in today's social media landscape will always include misinformation, increasingly so with rapid advancements in AI. I mean, I think just this week we saw the power of AI being able to promote misinformation. We're seeing it more and more. I guess a two-part question maybe. How do you see what is happening with that power of AI in terms of our information networking and environment? And what do you think are some techniques that folks need to be what I would call digitally literate
Yeah.
in this overwhelming sea of information?
AI only exacerbates the problem that I've been discussing because it is very easy to generate realistic looking false information. The thing that the president posted just yesterday with Chuck Schumer, and Hakeem Jeffries, which to me was racist and offensive, and fake. To some people, sort of looks real, or what Schumer is saying, which he wasn't actually saying, was AI generated. People have a hard time deciphering because it's so eerily like realistic. So it only exacerbates this phenomenon of the difficulty of sifting what's true from what is not. The more important question is, what do we do about that, right? I don't think it would be very fruitful to spend a lot of time on the supply side of this. I think we should focus on the demand side. I don't think Section 230 is going anywhere. I don't think we're going to rein in the power of this technology. I think it is here to stay. I don't think we're going to change the fact that this ecosystem exists, but we can change our own level of understanding and engagement with it, right? We should be teaching your students and younger kids how algorithms work and how to think critically and seek out different sources of information to sift what's true from what's not. We need to help people be more literate consumers of information, particularly that they receive through social media. That is where I would spend my time instead of trying to change the inputs or the rules. I think that is unlikely to be successful. We ought to acknowledge that these tools are out there and help people be more responsible, more thoughtful users of those tools. And that starts from a very young age in our schools, teaching kids how they should understand the information that is reaching them.
And you candidly, and I think this is a good segue to a very candid moment that you wrote in your book, that you admit you even find yourself falling prey to siloed
Yeah.
information, information that reinforces your own perspective. You know, we hear so much about confirmation bias and this issue of anchoring bias, where whatever piece of information you first get really kind of frames and shapes how you think about a particular issue that is at play in our politics. Um, can you share some insight as to how you try to avoid those biases? What can be done to kind of escape those biases and seek to lessen the polarization that it's obvious these biases bring to us?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I am an educated consumer of information, and I still fall prey to this. I listen to NPR when I'm driving to work. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post. I watch cable news. I appear on cable news. I have a tendency to sort of consume a perspective coming through those outlets that is sort of left leaning, right? Look, I've had the experience of being on television with people and being asked questions that are leading, that are sort of suggesting an answer that is pushing me further to the progressive left than I want to go. And I've been sort of mindful of saying, I question the premise of that question. This often comes up in the context of Supreme Court analysis, where people say, well, Supreme Court is trying to help, President Trump. And I'm like, yeah, they made this decision that does in fact endorse or seem to support his policy, but you're ascribing a motivation to that I don't see evidence of. It might just be a judicial philosophy rather than a political motivation. But the assumption in the question is that the court is sort of rigged to favor the president that appointed most of them. So
Right.
this is an example of the kind of thing that does reinforce this sort of siloed polarization in our media. So my answer to that is A, to be mindful of it, right? To realize that, hey, periodically I got to pick my head up out of that tunnel and look at other sources. I do sometimes turn the channel to Fox News or read things that are coming from a different perspective. That's hard sometimes because there's some outrage and some things that come from other sources that I just think are wrong or have a similar spin but in a different direction that can
Sure.
be aggravating. So I don't think I do this enough because sometimes when I do it, it provokes kind of an anger or emotional reaction. But it's really important to do. A lot of times when I do talks about the book, people ask me, well, where do I go for balanced information? And my answer is, I wish that I could point you to a site or to one outlet, and I really can't. Like my advice is to not settle for one, but to look at multiple sites, right? Like to read something from the New York Times and something from the Washington Examiner or the Wall Street Journal, although the journal isn't any longer, sort of perceived as right leaning. Like you have to seek out multiple sources for things, and this is hard and time consuming.
Hmm.
But I wish there was a place that I could say, if you just go to X, that X is meaning the generic X. You just
Right.
go to Smith and Company, and that will give you a straight down the middle perspective. I don't have that site in mind. Therefore, you have to go to multiple sources and piece together your own critical thought informed by those sources.
Within this expansive dynamic of information almost overload from time to time, it really feels like, and you've mentioned the division of the country in your work with the Charlottesville review of the rally, Unite the Right rally, and the January 6th Select Committee. You talk very specifically that it feels like to you the division is not necessarily political now, but it has moved more culturally. And with the lack of faith in our institutions, with the kind of mistrust or lack of even basic trust, we're becoming, in your words, more by cynicism about the pillars of American society. How do you see this lack of faith within the basic principles that has founded and undergirded our country, and where do you see the work that needs to be done to rebuild those pillars?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. Just an example of this from Charlottesville. I lived in Charlottesville for almost 15 years prior to Unite the Right. I raised my kids there and was an assistant U.S. attorney there and saw it as this really idyllic, wonderfully prosperous, safe, happy community that in which I was fortunate to live. When I was doing the work on the Charlottesville review, I spoke to a lot of people that had a very different lived experience right down the street from me, right? Like Charlottesville's a small town. And I would talk to somebody in the morning who said, man, it was an impossible situation for police and for city planners to manage. You had a lot of people who came here from outside who were determined to fight. How could they possibly, have anticipated? And then I would talk to somebody in the afternoon who said, well, of course the police weren't there for us on August 12th. They're not there for us on any Saturday in this community, right? They are not there to protect and serve me. I experienced that in my daily life. So fundamentally different attitudes about law enforcement and corresponding faith in that institution and broader institutions exist right in this community that I thought was happy and healthy. So it's sort of an eye-opening moment for me that my experience as a privileged, white male in our society isn't always typical. So when you see that, it's hard not to the second part of your question, think about, well, what's the fix? And there are a lot of different ways we can fix it. One is to make those systems work better, right? Like one way to increase faith in institutions is for institutions to be more responsive to people, whether that's police being more engaged in communities and actually policing more as guardians than warriors. There's a lot of discussion about sort of different approaches to policing, but generating legitimacy in communities so that there's more trust when there are threats to public safety, to government being more responsive to the issues that people are struggling with, right? The price of gasoline, or the availability of labor, or gun violence, and the persistent threats, the climate issues that we like. Our government is not really addressing those core bread and butter issues that are on people's minds, and that enhances cynicism. So that one way to fix this is to make those institutions work better. But the other way is for all of us to, in our own small way, ensure that we are not living in these silos. Going back to the social media point, I tell this a quote in the book, Michelle Obama, who says it's hard to hate up close. She talks about going around the country with her husband when he was president, lots of skeptical rooms where people, were not political supporters, were skeptical of them. And she said, over the course of those encounters, they would talk about the weather, they'd talk about their kids, or they would talk about some issue that they had in common, and that barriers broke down, right? By the end of the meeting, there was less skepticism because they're just regular people who have lots of points of connection. So we had to do that in our own lives, right? Like pull up close to each other, right? Instead of writing off people that have a different experience than you or have a different political ideology than you, we need to find ways for shared experience and pulling up close. And I think that would enhance not only our understanding of the world, it would lessen division, and it would give us that's the core of democracy, more connectivity and more faith in each other.
That was one thing that really stood out to me in one of the chapters, and I want to read what you wrote. You wrote, quote, "We infrequently interact with or have a chance to learn from people who have opinions or experiences very different from our own, which in turn breeds mistrust and misunderstanding. We tend to fear what we don't understand and to
Yeah.
be judgmental of people different from us. In other words, we hate from a distance, not close up." Um, how can people watching this webinar, thinking about what can I do to begin to breach the divide, how can this be used in their daily activities to start to maybe right the ship and turn it into a different direction, do you think?
I think it has to start at a really organic level, right? Micro, not macro. I hear so many people who say, man, the system is so flawed and that things have gone so awry. How can I possibly affect that? My answer is you can affect your own circle, your own life, your own neighborhood, your own workplace, your own school. Democracy comes down to people, Michael. It comes down to individuals acting in good faith to do their part as citizens. And in my view, being willing to give the benefit of the doubt to each other, to listen empathetically, generously to people with whom we disagree, to not walk by the person who's got a yard sign of a different candidate in her yard, but to stop and talk to her, to find ways to find points of connection. I think people are fundamentally more alike than they are different, regardless of political ideology or even lived experience. The same basic core values we all share, right? We want freedom. We want the ability to pursue happiness. We want these basic immutable things. We may go about those differently, but we share those values. And when we find ways to focus on those shared values, then you pull up close. I'm really attracted. One of the things I talk about in the book is for government to incentivize ways to enhance shared experience. I really like the idea, for instance, of a national service program. Like some
Hmm.
countries around the world, it's mandatory. Like if when you're 22, you have to spend 2 years in the Israeli military. I wouldn't make this mandatory, but if I were a policymaker, I would want to create opportunities for young people to give a couple of years of their time, whether it's military service or civil service, whether it's like building trails out west or working in a nursing home in a big city, in exchange for some benefit, tax amnesty for 4 years or 5 years. Because what would happen is people from the affluent side of the tracks and people from the poor side of the tracks would be working together on these common endeavors, all incentivized to participate in this national program. And we would be up close. We would have shared experience. We would realize our shared humanity. I grew up as a team sport athlete, right? And I played football with kids that had a very different sort of neighborhood or life than mine. And those differences between our lived experience were less important than getting a first down or winning the game or winning a championship. So when you take the focus away from those politics or money and you put it on an external goal, then things break down. So we need to find more ways in our own lives. Your question was, what do people do? What are people listening to this? You find ways in your own life to have shared experience, listen to, connect with, and manifest those common values with your neighbors.
Do you think, and this is something that, at least in the discipline that I learn and teach and research in, that we have become so siloed, that we have become so sorted in so many aspects, not just in the political aspects. The political parties have become much more like-minded, as opposed to when we had Southern conservative Democrats and liberal Northeastern Republicans. The people have kind of moved into their respective tribes, not just politically, but it feels like at times, in social aspects, in residential patterns, we see so many people moving into kind of like-minded communities that interacting with somebody from the opposite side is something that is so totally different and outside the norm of what they typically experience.
Yeah.
But you make a point about a startling statistic I found, that 49% of Americans feel like they're a stranger in their own country.
Yeah.
How, if is it going to require a lot of hard work on all of our parts to do those kinds of things, to make the kind of outreach that you're advocating for?
Yes. Two answers to that, sort of the big picture answer and the more small ball answer.
Sure.
The big picture answer is that wealth inequality in this country is really exacerbated over time, right? The distance between rich and poor has lengthened. There's a smaller middle class. There are fewer neighborhoods or places in which people have come together from different directions. We have these enclaves of wealth, and we have a continued persistent level of poverty, and those divisions have only gotten worse. So part of this is a function of that. And if we lessened wealth inequality through policy, right, economic policy and economic opportunity and education as a leveler, then I think there would be more opportunities for this shared experience, and people wouldn't feel like strangers in their own country. That's a longer term and more vexing issue. In the short term, people have to do that themselves. Again, the theme of the book is democracy is us. There's no external force that is coming to save it. No person who's elected to any office is a savior or will fix this. We have to fix this. We have to do this ourselves as citizens of good faith in a democracy every day. And that means, again, reaching out to the person who's at the next pew in church who might have voted for somebody different, or listening to a different voice in terms of the information you consume through social or mainstream media, or not demonizing or assuming the worst about something, about someone who has a different experience or perspective than yours, right? Those are democracy skills that on a very, very basic level, we all need to practice every day. You teach at a college. Colleges ought to be the laboratories where this is most easily done, right? Catawba College brings in people from all over the place, and there are
Mhm.
conservatives and there are progressives, and they're all eating the same food in the dining hall, and they're all, dealing with the storm and the difficulty to walk to class in the rain. Colleges, our institutions of higher ed ought to be laboratories for this, right? Ought to be places where people can learn how to listen to each other, how to disagree constructively, and interact with, take advantage of the diversity. We work so hard in colleges and universities to create diversity in terms of the population, the faculty, and the students. And then what happens in a lot of schools is that we don't take advantage of that because students sort of self-select and are join various affinity groups that are siloed, that retreat, that lay the foundation for later in life, spending a lot of your time and talking to people much like yourselves. So again, college students, right, take advantage of the opportunity you have to learn from, to interact with people that are different from you, because that's harder to do in the regular in life when you get out and you're working 9 to 5. It's a lot easier to do in college.
I always tell my students, you've got 4 years to fail.
Yeah,
And
good advice.
I don't necessarily mean fail a class, but fail at things that are going to, in the future, you are going to have to be challenged by, to confront, to work towards.
Yeah,
Communication
yeah,
skills, the ability to listen, the ability to hear another perspective and be willing to say, you know what, I hadn't thought of this particular side of this particular issue. Maybe I've changed my perspective. It feels like so much of what we're dealing with is, as you have rightly noted, so siloed in terms of our thinking that we're unwilling, or our brains are unwilling to say, you know what, I hadn't thought about that.
exactly.
And that kind of 4 years, maybe 5 years of being in an environment where you can come in and be challenged and yet think about things that you're going to be confronting into the future. You know, we do a lot of work in higher education, but we were talking before the webinar started about civic education, about the need in K through 12.
Yeah.
Are these things that, we could start to see in our public schools in K through 12 to start building a generation
Mhm.
that has the democracy skills that you talked about?
Yes, 100% agree, Michael. Absolutely. Look, too many of our kids are being given facts and not skills to process those facts. So I think education, and some of this is schools, some of this is parents or other organizations that work with young people. Facts are important. Kids need to learn their multiplication tables and they need to learn how to write, but they also need to learn democracy skills. So we should be teaching democracy skills. We should be teaching, for instance, how to consume information and be skeptical about misinformation, how those platforms are sending them stuff, and practical ways that they should round out their exposure. We should be modeling constructive disagreement. People that learn how to argue in a way that's constructive, not destructive. Um, Education ought to include these really fundamental democracy skills in addition to conveying facts. Um, and we don't spend enough time on that, right? Like I tried to do that with my own kids and my own family by both modeling it myself and talking to them directly about it, particularly when it came to social media and helping them understand, what those platforms do and how information reaches them. But not every kid has that, right? They don't have someone in their ear sort of helping them navigate that. So I do think public education in this country is a place that we ought to look hard at starting the formation of these democracy skills, these life skills.
We've talked a lot about what the average citizen, the average American can do. You cite another data point that really stuck out to me, that two-thirds of Americans consider it a serious problem that our elected officials, our politicians, are more interested in blocking the other party than in getting anything done.
Yeah,
And how can citizens get our candidates, our public officials, those who ultimately represent us, to believe in this notion of public service, that it's not a I get 100%, you get nothing, I win, you lose, that we can have a sense of, you know what, I'm only going to get 50%, but you're going to get 50%, and we move on to the next debate and questions.
Yeah. That's hard, Michael, because the rules that generally apply at the federal and the state level discourage compromise and protect incumbency. So, you know this, in North Carolina, just like in Virginia, just like in Congress, the vast majority of legislative districts are drawn affirmatively to be safe Republican or safe Democratic. That is an explicit goal of those who draw those boundaries. So the only way you lose is if you're a Democrat in a safe Democratic district in Charlotte, or you're a Republican who's in a safe red district in Monroeville, or a rural part of the state. The only way you lose is if you're sort of outflanked to the extreme, right? Like if you're in a safe district, I don't want to be somebody who's more blue or more red than I. That's the only way I lose. And when you add to that the incessant flow of special interest money that largely goes to incumbents, then the way the rules operate now, it's very hard to get incumbents dislodged. And because of those two twin evils of gerrymandering and money in politics, there's just not a lot of incentive to compromise. When you add the other thing that augments this is that our legislators now no longer know each other or spend as much time together as they used to. I went right out of college, worked for Senator Biden became President Biden, but then he was Senator Biden, and he and Strom Thurmond, different political approaches, were friends, and they were both in Washington all the time, and they spent a lot of time together. Now, when I worked on the January 6th committee, I was amazed at how every member of the committee, every weekend, flew home, right? Even the ones from California. Thursday night, they were on an airplane, and they were back Monday morning. And they don't know each other. They don't have, and when they're in Washington, they're largely at events and fundraisers. They're raising money, or they're back in their districts. So the old days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, having a drink together in the White House and talking policy, there's not as many of those opportunities anymore. So anyway, long predicate to your question, the rules just do not facilitate compromise. Don't incentivize compromise. How do we affect that? We should think about changing those rules, right? Those issues, how we draw districts, campaign finance, those are sort of root cause issues that we should be demanding that our legislators talk about. And again, we should show up and engage, and not just pull the party line lever, but ask our elected officials at every level, from the school board to the U.S. senators, demand through the political process that they talk about the things that matter. What are we going to do about gun violence? Well, the climate is on fire. What are we going to do to protect our kids' future with respect to, like, we need to hold them accountable. And we don't have the levels of political participation in this country, Michael, are extremely low. In the 2024 presidential election, about 2/3, 66% of registered voters voted. So fully a third of people that had registered to vote did not cast a ballot. And that doesn't even touch all the voting age Americans who didn't register.
Right.
So that's shocking. Like these are consequential decisions, as we're seeing, that you need to weigh in on, right? You need to let your voice be heard. And when you don't go vote, you don't participate, you don't ask those questions because you're not informed or you don't care, then you give outsized power to perspectives across the board, right or left, that are not as mainstream, but are energized by a single issue or special interest. So I have a ton of faith that our elected officials will be more responsive and our government will be more effective and democracy will be maintained if everybody in America participates. Again, I have a lot of faith in the goodness of people across the board politically, but not everybody participates. And that is the problem, right? If everybody 100% did this, we'd be fine. But what happens is that people sit it out, and that gets back to the apathy point we were talking about before.
And you raise in one phrase that I think really I was struck by in the book, that in your work on the January 6th Select Committee, you took away, you said you learned, quote, that democracy depends on individual decision makers,
Yeah.
unquote. What can you talk a little bit about how that learned aspect really shaped what you took away from that work?
Yeah. People ask me sometimes, what was the biggest surprise, biggest lesson from the Jan 6 investigation? And I say it almost worked, right? But for a handful of courageous people who put principle over politics, it would have worked, right? And these are people with whom I disagree politically. Bill Barr, I was a U.S. attorney in the Obama administration where we were really focused on fairness in sentencing and criminal justice reform. Bill Barr, very different approach to criminal justice. But at a crucial time in our history, he told the truth, right? He told the President of the United States, those claims of election fraud are bullshit, right? He said this repeatedly, directly to the president. Not a favorable audience. The president was very, very angry with him,
Right.
right? So he stood up at a time and put principle over politics. Mike Pence was pressured relentlessly to take an action that he didn't believe he had the constitutional legal authority to take. He could not unilaterally reject certified slates of electors submitted by states around the country. And he said, look, I have to accept these. That is my constitutional duty. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, the Secretary of State, who's getting relentless pressure from the White House to find 11,000 votes. He said, we've looked, we've counted, we've recounted. This is the result. He told the truth. So those are profiles in courage that people did the right thing. My fear is that in the second Trump administration, the credential that has gotten people jobs is more loyalty than competence. And I fear that those guardrails of principled people, there are fewer of them willing to speak up for those norms and those principles. So again, the theme we keep coming back to, democracy isn't some external thing that is there as a shield for us.
Hmm.
It's an up from the ground thing where people like Mike Pence or you who are watching this and listening have to perpetuate it, right? It's in our collective hands. And thankfully, Republican or Democrat, it's been in good hands over the years. And we have to make sure that it stays in good hands by doing our own part to engage and participate, just like Mike Pence did, just like Bill Barr did, just like Brad Raffensperger did.
We've got a question from Chris, and this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation. But Chris asks, are there ways to call media sources to account that are not being adequately used? He says, I realize Section 230 makes it hard to do for platforms, but maybe subject to them to other kinds of accountability. Is there a role for government to place a kind of boundary on this wild west of media outlets and so much information out there, or is it going to be incumbent upon, again, we the people to be able to address these issues?
It's really tricky here because the more government imposes control, the more potential infringement we have with respect to the First Amendment, right? Government does not make decisions based on content. It's a fundamental principle of our Constitution. Government cannot pick and choose between speech that it favors or it does not. I talked to a lot of people in Charlottesville who said, why couldn't the city just say no to these racists who wanted a permit to come and sort of march and say noxious things in the middle of our city? And the answer is because government doesn't pick and choose between what speech is okay and what is not. Government is neutral and regulation is content neutral. So if you were to have governmental control over any news gathering or news dissemination, and the government was making decisions about, even if you took it away from content and made truth or falsity, that's subjective to some extent. A lot of times this is opinion. I just think it's really dangerous. I don't really think that the answer here is going to come from some regulation. I therefore think that the answer here to your question, Chris, has to be us, right? It has to be the best check on misinformation is the market and people rejecting those sources that are false or unreliable. And if educated consumers are doing a better job of sifting, then credible sources that are more insightful will have more success, and those that do not will have less success. And there are market forces that will help take care of that. So I'm skeptical about government regulation as solving this problem.
As we're getting close to time here, I want to bring up a question that I thought about in reading, particularly your conclusion about some things that we, the public, we, the people, can do. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about one of my favorite TV shows. There's a scene in this series where a gentleman challenges another gentleman to a dart game and thinks that this other guy, he's just a bumpkin. He doesn't know how to throw darts. I'll win this easily. And Ted Lasso talks about coming across a quote, be curious, not judgmental.
Right.
And so much of what your conclusion was trying to do was really to challenge our assumptions. What do you think, why do you think it's so hard for us to be curious, to not fall into being judgmental and to allow us to have our assumptions challenged? Is it a lack of humility? Is it a lack of not being civically prepared for what this system of government requires of us?
It's all of that. Yes, it is lack of humility, lack of curiosity, uh, lack of ability to step out of that pipeline of information that throws anger and vitriol at us all the time. This is exacerbated. Candidly, I'm going to show my sort of political bias here. It's exacerbated by a president who stokes this, right? Who demonizes and in his rhetoric pits some against others. I think that's irresponsible and immoral. But again, it's not his fault or anybody social media's fault. It's our responsibility to sift that and factor it into how we are going to show up in a democracy. That anger, that vitriol, that negativity is going to be, unfortunately, a fact of life these days in America. So thinking about how you are going to process and fall prey to or resist that kind of narrative, it comes down to individual choice. And then when I say participate and engage, that's really what, to me, what it comes down to, right? You start with yourself before you even think about a conversation with somebody else. You start with how you understand issues in the world, how you personally educate yourself, how your thoughts and feelings are manifested by what you're receiving. Like, start with you, then from you, it's to your immediate circle. And then ultimately, I think that ripples to our elected representative government, right? There are levels to this, but everybody here can start with that basic level, which is their own heart and their own head and their own understanding of and reaction to what they're hearing.
What gives you hope for the future of our American democracy?
I am ultimately optimistic. Uh, um, because I do think that most people are good, and I think that goodness will be always there regardless of who's president or what the media says. I also think there is a scenario in our politics by which some of what we're seeing in terms of policy is an overreach and prompts a much more powerful backlash, right? So Dr. King and Barack Obama, like, Dr. King said, the arc of history bends toward justice. It's jagged, it goes back and forth, but it bends toward justice. I just heard recently former President Obama say, it bends toward justice, but we got to push it there, right? It doesn't bend by itself. We have to push it there. So I do think there's a scenario to this point about apathy that the policies of this administration, right, deporting people that are here working hard and the tariffs that are going to increase everybody's prices and the use of the military in domestic affairs, there could be a backlash to that in terms of participation and engagement that is more powerful than that. That in the midterm elections or in the next presidential election, what's happening now encourages more interest, more engagement, more participation, and that ultimately leads to a better place. Because again, my premise here is that the more of us who are paying attention, the better our government will be, the more sound our democracy will be. And in a weird way, the current administration is an antidote to sitting things out, right? Like that they're going to inspire you, and maybe in a supportive way for some, but that's a level of engagement too, which matters, or it could be in an outraged negative way, but it's going to encourage attention and engagement, and that's a good thing.
Tim Heaphy, thank you so much for your insights, for your time today, and talking with us, and for your work in addressing the threats to our American democracy. I know I've learned something, and I hope our viewers have as well. And I'm very appreciative of you taking the time to join us here today.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. Thank you. The fact that people have tuned into this shows that I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. They're engaged and they want to participate. My book, Harbingers, which is available everywhere, there's a lot more of this there. There's a lot more specifics there. There's a lot about Charlottesville on January 6th and what they have in common. And then there's a whole bunch about ways in which people should be showing up in a democracy. So I appreciate the invitation and the interest in the book. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thanks certainly to folks who joined us today for this Lunch and Learn. This was sponsored by Catawba College's Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service, along with the NC Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. We'll actually be posting this session on our YouTube channel, so you can send your friends this particular session. The YouTube channel is youtube.com/at NC Politics. And if you have a thought about another topic that you'd like to think would be a good lunch and learn, please feel free to email me, politics@catawba.edu. Again, Tim, thank you so much for your time, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.